My name is JonBenet Ramsey, and I'm 5.5.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 5 in the Khan's Order series, and in this episode we will look at the way that the judge appraised the autopsy findings. And once again, I think this is going to be a cracker of an episode. Some very controversial findings from Judge Judy Khan's. I think it's important to note that the Khan's order occurred during the reign, if that's the word, during the time that Boulder District Attorney Mary Keenan took responsibility and control for the investigation. She actually took the case away from the Boulder Police Department. Part of that process was reinvestigating the DNA evidence. Something else that you may not be aware of is that Mary Keenan met with the Ramseys in February of 2003 in a 4-hour meeting. And for that meeting, although the Ramseys didn't have an attorney present, there was an attorney there for the first 10 minutes of the meeting. The Khan's order came out on the 31st of March 2003, and what that tells you is that it post-dated that meeting with the Ramseys between Mary Keenan and the Ramseys, which I think is quite interesting. I also don't think it would have been surprising that Mary Keenan would have taken her leaf out of the Khan's order, basically saying, okay, this proves what I was thinking all along, kind of thing. I'll put a link to an article written by Paula Woodward on the 7th of April 2003 dealing with the Khan's order. Bear in mind, Paula Woodward has also written a book, an apologia, that basically supports all of the positions really of the Ramseys, the intruder theory and so on. In this episode, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be dealing with the autopsy evidence, and it's always interesting seeing it through the eyes of a seasoned judge, and especially in this case, seeing how certain things are interpreted and misinterpreted. Before we get to that, I want to refer to something that I didn't mention in the previous episode. It's really just the last point made somewhere near the bottom of page 16, where Judge Khan's writes, quote, brown cotton fibers on JonBenet's body, the paintbrush, the duct tape, and on the ligature were not sourced and do not match anything in the Ramsey home. Now, I'm not sure if I'm misreading that. I'm not sure if she means brown cotton fibers on the paintbrush, brown cotton fibers on the duct tape, brown cotton fibers on the ligature, or if she's saying brown cotton fibers on JonBenet's body, that's one item. The paintbrush, that's another item. The duct tape is another item. And then it says, and on the ligature were not sourced and do not match anything. I'm not quite sure whether she means she's talking about the brown cotton fibers. If she isn't, it just seems absurd that she's saying, the paintbrush doesn't match anything in the Ramsey home when a fragment of the paintbrush was recovered from the paint tote. If she's not saying that, then I think it's crazy that it's not brought up. In other words, it's fair to say that wasn't sourced from the Ramsey home, that wasn't sourced from the Ramsey home. Well, what about the things that were sourced? For example, the paintbrush. For example, the notepad, a crucial piece of evidence. For example, the pen, right? And so on and so on. I think one of the best parts of the JonBenet Ramsey crime scene, when I say best, I mean one of the most crucial areas where you have the crime fairly unambiguous. I mean, if you remove the duct tape, if you forget about the ligatures around her wrists, you forget about the window dressing, and you just say, okay, what does her body tell us? What does this little child's body tell us about what happened to her? I think that is really the ground zero of the crime scene, and I think that speaks volumes. And so I think it's going to be very interesting to look at what Judge Khan says about this. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So we are at the bottom of page 16, and this is quoting from the Khan's order. Quote, "The autopsy of JonBenet's body was concluded on December 27th, 1996 by the Boulder County Coroner's Office. The cause of JonBenet's death was asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma." End quote. Now, Kitty, come on. Now, in the past, I've been heavily criticized for saying something along the lines that JonBenet's death, the cause of JonBenet's death was asphyxia by strangulation. So this is the judge quoting from the autopsy report, and asphyxia is mentioned first, right? And what is the way that it is mentioned is the cause of JonBenet's death was asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma, right? I've already made the case previously that it appears to me, this is my interpretation, that the craniocerebral trauma was possibly not life-threatening, that it was potentially survivable. It's not just an assumption, it is based on reading the autopsy report, it's based on looking at the level of hemorrhage, how deep it goes into the brain tissues, and then it's also looking at very important symptomatic aspects of it, which is, what are the signs of hemorrhage? Is there, for example, blood coming out of JonBenet's ears? Answer, no. Is there a lot of blood coming out of her mouth? Answer, no. Is there blood in her eyes? No. Nostrils? No. Lungs? No. All of that tends to suggest that the cerebral trauma was ancillary, secondary, kind of a supplement to the actual cause of death, right? So the other part of that, I think, is the fact that the skin on JonBenet's head isn't even broken, and you even had a scenario where people who found JonBenet didn't think that they basically, I think, assumed that she'd been strangled. That was the first assumption. And it's quite incredible when you read the autopsy report, the coroner, it goes quite far through it. He's almost halfway through it before he discovers the cerebral trauma. And then he kind of goes down a different path after that. So I got very heavily criticized because people were saying, you are saying the cause of death was asphyxia, but it says associated with craniocerebral trauma. Well, first of all, the coroner mentions asphyxia first, and the second thing is that he says associated, right? He doesn't even say complicated, he just says associated. I'm not saying that the craniocerebral trauma had no impact. It obviously did. What I am saying is, both in terms of the letter of the autopsy and my interpretation, so it's both. Another way that I could say it, if the autopsy report did it the other way around, well, I don't know, maybe I would have deferred to the coroner, but it's also possible that I would have argued with it and said, you know what, I don't agree with it. And I'll give you an example where I've done that. In the Chris Watts case, I believe the cause of death of the children was possibly chemical overdose. And you might say, yes, but there's no evidence of that in the autopsy. True, there isn't. But they were in a chemical bath for something like 3 or 4 days. And so you've got to bear that in mind. So you've got to interpret things to some extent. It's also possible that while they were sedated, they were asphyxiated. You just don't see the signs of asphyxia in the Chris Watts case with the children that you see with JonBenet, and that is something that I think is definitely questionable. So to come back to this, I firmly believe that the cause of death was asphyxia. I also differ with some of the experts who seem to think that JonBenet had kind of a bump on her head or a knock on her head, and she survived for even hours after that, or minutes after that, or a long time after that. You know, it's the Steve Thomas scenario that she cracked her head on the back of a bathtub or some object and then appeared unconscious, even though her heart was still beating, and then she was asphyxiated. But some period later. I don't see it like that at all. I see it as that it happened kind of simultaneously. And I think you can explain some of the problems with the cerebral trauma by thinking more holistically and saying, well, what if the cerebral trauma happened at almost the same time as this ligature constricted around her neck? In other words, it actually restricted the blood flow. So it's possible that the blood there wasn't as much blood as there could have been because of the asphyxiation, right? The other thing to bear in mind is the length of time asphyxia might take, compared to the compared to the length of time that brain damage might take. And it's a difficult thing to put on paper, it's comparing apples with pears essentially. But you can imagine in a scenario, craniocerebral trauma, it can take days, months, even years to die from. Depending on how serious it is, it can also take moments to die if it's serious enough. But here we have a case where, although the skull was fractured, the brain underneath was relatively unscathed. You didn't have a splitting of the brain, the body of the brain, the way you had it with the skull. And I think that says a lot about the object that she was struck with, that it was something that had kind of an elastic way of distributing energy, something like a softball or baseball bat. And that is why I don't think the flashlight was used. There are other reasons for that as well, including that the bulb of the flashlight wasn't damaged, the lens wasn't cracked. There was absolutely no evidence found on the flashlight either. I think on a baseball bat found in the garden, they found a fiber from the basement carpet, which I think is interesting. I don't know if it necessarily takes us anywhere. I also think, didn't someone say something about a hair found on a golf club in the garden? Well, that's also possible, but I personally don't think a golf club was used either, just because of this elasticity, the distribution of energy wouldn't work. Anyway, just going further through the Khan's report, the autopsy report supports the conclusion that she was alive before she was asphyxiated by strangulation, and that she fought her attacker in some manner. Now, once again, you have an interesting parallel here with JonBenet and the Watts children. There's also this idea that Bella fought for her attacker. I don't believe that is the case. Again, it's about interpreting the evidence. I agree that JonBenet was alive. I think she actually tried to get her fingers underneath the cord. I think it was complicated by the gold chain she was wearing and the type of knot. And I think just before the asphyxiation, I think she screamed. And I think that was what prompted the blow from the bat. I don't actually think so I actually feel like the blow from the bat happened just before the noose around her neck would have prevented her from screaming, if that makes sense. But I see it happening a second or two, just a few moments before the noose around her throat tightened. So now we're on page 17 of the Khan's report. Quote, evidence gathered during the autopsy is consistent with the inference that she struggled to remove the garrote from her neck. Moreover, both parties agree the autopsy report reveals injury to JonBenet's genitalia consistent with a sexual assault shortly before her death. End quote. So there you have actually some agreement, and I really think that the sexual assault doesn't implicate Patsy. I'm not saying that it definitely, in a situation like that you could say absolutely not, but it just, from a common sense perspective, from a logic perspective, from what is generally seen in these sorts of situations, you would tend to think that it would exclude Patsy. I personally think that it does. But once again, the same way the word garrote is used, as far as I'm concerned, incorrectly. I've seen other people use the term commando rope or buddy rope. I think that is perhaps a better term for this contraption. I don't think sexual assault is the correct term. Sexual assault is typically when an adult sexually assaults another adult, and it can also be when an adult sexually assaults a minor, right? I don't think that is the case here. And I also think sexual assault is not always, but tends to involve one person acting in a way that the other is uncomfortable with. I don't like to talk about this area because you need to back it up you need to anchor it in the evidence, and you need kind of a narrative around it, and you need to make your point very, very carefully and properly. And it's a bit of a minefield, so I don't really like to talk about it. And when I do talk about it, I get attacked that, while you are minimizing sexual assault or something like that. And in that case, that is because the people criticizing me don't actually understand what I'm trying to say and don't seem to want to think about that possibility either. So going back to the Khan's order, page 17, quote, although no head injury was visible when she was first discovered, the autopsy revealed that she received a severe blow to her head shortly before or around the time of the murder, end quote. Now, I agree with that. I agree that the head blow occurred shortly before. That's what I think that is true, that the head blow actually occurred first. And then the judge refers to Michael Dobison, a doctor, who said something along the lines that the presence of hemorrhage does indicate that the victim was alive when she sustained the head injury. However, the relatively small amount of subdural hemorrhage indicates that the injury occurred in the perimortem, close to death period. So Yari's confirmation that they're also saying, wow, it looks like there was kind of a small amount of subdural hemorrhage, right? I agree with that. And you've got to explain why that is the case. I think there are two explanations. One is, as I say, the fact that the blood flow was cut off at around the same time. And I also think the other thing is the type of object that caused the head injury. Because it distributed the energy as effectively as it did, the energy didn't go through the skull into the brain as you would with a hard, inelastic object such as a hammer or a brick or something like that. Then, quoting again from the Khan's order, quote, the coroner took nail clippings from JonBenet. Male DNA was found under JonBenet's right-hand fingernail. that does not match that of any Ramsey. Defendants, so let's just take it a little bit further than that. Now, the impression I get is that it was via the Wolf case that the DNA myth came about, that the DNA testing took place. And I'm not sure if this was when the Bode's lab report came to light, because the Bode report, I think, was sort of delivered to the Boulder District Attorney's Office, I think in 2008, March 2008, so I'm not sure whether that informed her decision. In any event, I think it's a misinterpretation by the judge of this. The fact that you have DNA under JonBenet's right-hand fingernail, if you say, well, it doesn't match that of any Ramsey, so what? The crime scene's contaminated. She had her fingers in the carpet fabric, and it's just not a DNA case. So I just don't think you can go the DNA area. You just can't go you can't go the DNA route, because it's not a DNA case. DNA isn't going to solve the case. The other thing is that subsequent DNA testing did show that in 2008 that the DNA found was very weak. You couldn't really form much of a profile, and if you could, you couldn't be absolutely certain that it wasn't a composite profile of several individuals. I don't really want to talk too much about DNA here, and interestingly, the judge doesn't either, but what she does say is that it doesn't match that of any Ramsey. What I find problematic with this is actually the DNA under JonBenet's fingernails did match a Ramsey, matched JonBenet's. So, technically that is not really accurate. Also, if you look at some of the DNA report, it talks about you can exclude all sorts of Ramseys, but you can't necessarily include or exclude Burke or Patsy. It's almost like the same fingerprints that you get on the pineapple, the same people involved in those fingerprints, you couldn't really exclude from some of the DNA analysis. Of course, that's not mentioned here either. Fortunately, Judge Carnes goes on and refers to the bleeding in JonBenet's genital area, and she says that also indicates that JonBenet was alive when she was assaulted. I agree with that as well. I believe she was alive, and that is actually the reason that she cried out. Was what happened to her was unexpected. You can think of two scenarios. One, that she was being assaulted in a way that was involuntary. She was restrained or something, and then when this happened to her, she screamed out. I tend to think of it in another way, is that she was in a playful situation, where the bonds around her were more symbolic and playful than anything else, and not only her but her assaulter was also, let's say, playing around and didn't realize what he was doing was going to be as painful as it turned out to be. And then this led to her screaming out. So I don't think she expected or even wanted to scream out until that point. And so that was a surprise to her. I think it was also a surprise to the person responsible. I don't really agree with the language used by the judge, but she says, quote, her hymen was torn and material consistent with wooden shards from the paintbrush used to make the garrote were found in a vagina, end quote. Now, the language there I find quite excessive. I think it is more accurate to say her hymen was damaged. But no matter what word you want to use, there's also when she talks about material consistent with wooden shards. That's not necessarily the case either. It's birefringent material, which could have been a sort of layer of paint on the wood. That could have been this material that was found, and it could also be a wooden shard. We don't know. But again, the way that she's describing it sounds like this sexual assault by an adult, and there's this severe genital damage, almost akin to a rape or something like that. And even when you want to talk about bleeding in the genital area, it's a bit of a exaggeration. There was tiny little drops of blood. There was kind of perforation of the hymen, but in a small way. And so the impression I get is that the judge doesn't actually understand the scale of what she's referring to here. When I say that, I don't want to sound insensitive. I don't want to say that what happened to JonBenet was acceptable. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying it is important to not misinterpret, and also to know what level we are talking about. And I think that this is a big problem with the Ramsey case. Is there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of projection, and there's a lot of misinterpretation of what we're talking about, right? And it's because of preconceived ideas. You are imagining a certain individual being involved, and so you're imagining the scale of what is happening being commensurate to that individual, being relative to that thing that you have in your mind, and you're not looking at the evidence. You're not allowing the evidence to speak for itself. And so in the same way that there's a lot of exaggeration in the JonBenet Ramsey case, in the same way that the sexual assault is actually less egregious. I'm not saying it's acceptable. I'm just saying the injury itself is less severe than has been portrayed. In the same way, the head injury is actually also less severe than has been portrayed. One thing that I think you can't exaggerate is the neck injury, although I think it has been exaggerated by calling the device that was used a garrote. I don't think it was a garrote. Nevertheless, the impact of this device was pretty horrible. The way that it cut into her neck, that injury is definitely pretty awful to look at, and caused JonBenet, unfortunately, a lot of pain and cost her life. One thing I don't think people have thought about is, if JonBenet was fighting back, was the person who was responsible also trying to save her? In other words, trying to loosen the garrote around her neck. And I believe that that was happening. It may be the reason why you have that triangular welt on her chest, that some implement was used, possibly a knife or possibly something else, to try to get purchase between the skin and the cord of the garrote. I believe that same attempt to try and save JonBenet went further in terms of the trying to use the railway track as a defibrillator. I've heard some people laughing at that and saying that is crazy. Somebody said their husband overheard this and thought that is absolutely nonsense. Well, if you head into Foreign Faction, Kolar's book, he's got several photos showing the ends of the track, and then showing the injuries, showing the each end of the metal parts of the track, and showing how they correspond to the burn marks on JonBenet. In my imagination, I also imagine that JonBenet was initially lying on her back, and then when this interference occurred and she was hurt, she then squirmed and came into kind of a crawling position, bearing in mind there were still the loops around her wrists. And then when she was struck, she then came to a position lying on her stomach with her head to the side and her hands basically alongside her ears. Not really, in a lot of the descriptions, it's that her hands were above her head. It's basically, well, just above her head. But if you were in a crawling position and then you fell face down, your hands would come to that position anyway. So that is how I imagine it. And what is interesting is JonBenet had 2 of these burn wounds, which I think is made by a railway track, on her back, and another one is closer to her cheek. I see we're approaching 30 minutes, so let's move on to through the Khan's order. The court has not been able to determine from the record how close to death the peri-mortem period would have been. Now we go to page 18. Something about male DNA was found in JonBenet's underwear that does not match that of any Ramsey and has not yet been sourced. The Boulder Police Department has yet to identify the male whose DNA was found at the crime scene. Finally, a Caucasian pubic or auxiliary hair was found on the blanket covering JonBenet's body. The hair does not match that of any Ramsey and has not been sourced. According to my information, that hair was traced to Patsy Ramsey. And there's some interesting sort of evolution about how we didn't know about this and then how we did. You know, you had the CBI referring to the pubic hair in early 1997, and then you had the hair still unidentified in February 1998. By June 1998, it was still unidentified. And I think they then passed it on to the FBI for, you know, more elaborate mitochondrial DNA testing. Then in August 1998, the detectives resigned from the case. In 2000, Lawrence Schiller published his book, and there was sort of talk about the Ramsey attorneys were objecting to destructive tests. So by testing the artifact, it would be destroyed in the testing, through the process of the testing. Then in January 2002, Lou Smith gave a deposition in a defamation case involving the Ramseys. Obviously, it's the Chris Wolf case, and he says something about it's a pubic hair or an auxiliary hair, and he says if it is an auxiliary hair, it's probably from a male. And then he says someday they will be able to match that hair with someone because they are with mitochondrial DNA, etc., etc. And then he says something about that will be the strongest piece of evidence. Then in 2005, James Kolar was appointed the lead investigator, and he was given access to the case file. And then I think it was 2010, so 5 years after that, Lou Smith died. So Lou Smith died thinking that the pubic hair and the mitochondrial DNA on the pubic hair was going to be the best evidence of a male intruder. Then in 2012, 2 years after Lou Smith died, he confirmed that the mitochondrial DNA testing actually took place between August 1998 and 2005, in fact, while Lou Smith was still alive. And this is a quote from Kolar's book, Foreign Faction. Quote, "One particular sample of hair collected from the blanket that had been wrapped around JonBenet's body had initially given the appearance of being a pubic hair. Investigators thought this might belong to a male perpetrator. The FBI was later able to identify this as an auxiliary hair, underarm, back or chest, and determined it did not come from the pubic region of the body." Right? So it wasn't a pubic hair. Mitochondrial DNA tests were run on this hair, and the FBI technicians determined that the hair shaft did not belong to an identified stranger. Patsy Ramsey could not be excluded as the source of the hair, and it was noted that it could have come from either her or someone else in her maternal lineage, end quote. So what you have there is basically the a contention from the lead detective disputing what the judge is saying here, that the hair does not match that of any Ramsey and has not been sourced. And I presume that, you know, in our chronology here from Kolar, that there was testing between 98 and 2005. I imagine that this testing must have taken place somewhere around 2002 or 2003. In other words, very close to after this report. Anyway, it seems as though Carnes doesn't know about it. Doesn't know about the fact that the hair couldn't be excluded matching Patsy. And so if you think about what Lou Smith said, that this is potentially the strongest piece of evidence, it is something that Judge Carnes doesn't even, it's not even on the same page that it could actually have belonged to Patsy, and this was the case brought by Chris Wolf. Then going back to the Carnes order, and this is the final paragraph I'm dealing with on page 18, before we get to the ransom note, she says, finally, the coroner's report notes injuries on the right side of JonBenet's face and left lower back. While defendants assert that these injuries are consistent with the use of a stun gun, plaintiff notes that the coroner's report does not expressly state the injuries were the result of such an instrument, end quote. I think that's quite a good point from them, that even the coroner doesn't refer to a stun gun, and you must bear in mind the coroner probably deals with stun gun injuries all the time. A lot of people who are killed during police encounters are stun gunned, and so they don't even, the coroner didn't recognize it as a stun gun type of injury. I think that's a really good point. I think the other thing to point out is, and it's just, if you know the JonBenet Ramsey narrative, you know it. If you don't, you don't. The whole stun gun narrative was going to be tested and evaluated by exhuming JonBenet's body. So in the same way that the window became this integral part, the broken window, the open broken window, became an integral part of the intruder narrative almost after the fact, so did the stun gun thing. And when the stun gun thing became part of the intruder narrative, the investigators felt, well, we need to look at it again in order to exclude it. And then the Ramseys didn't want to allow JonBenet's remains to be exhumed. And there's quite an interesting media narrative where John Ramsey, I think, is saying, it's difficult to say what's true and what's not, because some of it is tabloid media and some of it isn't. But according to one of the reports, John was saying that they want to exhume the body to prove that a stun gun was used. And obviously, in the end, they never did, which I think speaks volumes as well, because I think had they exhumed JonBenet's body, they may have proved otherwise. This is one of the most frustrating parts for me in the Carnes order, this part right here. Quote, Dr. Michael Dobison, a forensic pathologist retained by the defendants who examined the Boulder coroner's autopsy report and autopsy photos, concludes the injuries to the right side of the face as well as of the lower back, the lower left back. So these other injuries were at the bottom of her back, right, are patterned injuries most consistent with the application of a stun gun, end quote. I don't agree with that at all. I have looked at stun gun injuries, and I've looked at what we see in this case, and the injuries here almost look like burn wounds. It is also the purple welt is also bigger than the pinkish reddish inflammation that you get with a stun gun. So I don't know whether Dr. Dobison's eyesight was affected, I certainly don't see it as being similar. I think one thing you can make the case for is that the distance between the welts is similar, or you could say a stun gun has two markings, and that JonBenet had two of these injuries, but not in every case. She had two on her back, but only one on the side of her face, right? I also think another big fault, a big flaw, a big problem with the stun gun theory is, I think the theory goes something like this. The intruder was unknown to JonBenet, and so when the intruder traipsed into JonBenet's room with the whole family present at home, on Christmas night kind of thing, he would have expected JonBenet to cry out, and so he silenced her using the stun gun. Now, have you ever heard how loud a stun gun is when it's activated? Have you ever heard the sound that a stun gun makes when it's used? Have a listen. Now, I wish I could find it, but when Lou Smith was asked about this, he had kind of an interesting response. He sort of put the stun gun into a pillow on television, so he was being interviewed, and then he pushed the stun gun into the middle of a pillow, and you could still hear it quite loudly in the interview. And he said, well, that is the way that you could muffle the sound of a stun gun. But if you think about it, Burke Ramsey's bedroom was on the same floor as JonBenet, and it's a loud noise. It's even with using a muffler. The other thing is, if a stun gun was used, well, it didn't work because JonBenet screamed regardless. So where does that narrative take you? I see we passed 40 minutes, so I'm not going to take it any further than that. In the next episode, episode 6, we will deal with how Judge Carnes deals with a ransom note, and she describes it as an extremely important clue, and we'll see where that takes us. For those interested in the Chris Watts case, in the next episode on this channel, I've taken a couple of your questions and I've tried to respond to them as completely as I can. It's questions that have come up quite often, and I just feel that it maybe is time that they are addressed. So look out for that. It should be out a couple of minutes after this episode. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.